Welcome back to Tales from Our Dark Past. Today's story takes us back to medieval England. During the 1,000 years that spanned between the 5th and the 15th century. Crime and punishment has changed dramatically throughout the dark past of human history. Today, most of us would be given a fair trial by jury and given a chance to prove our innocence. But what would have happened to you if you was unfortunate or foolish enough to commit a crime back during the medieval period? Some of these weird medieval laws are so strange that you might not have even realised that you were breaking a law at all. And some of the punishments on our list are so harsh that they could cost you your life. 1. Being bad at baking. Back in medieval Britain, being bad at baking didn't just blow your chances of winning the Great British Bake Off. It could see you suffer in awful and unimaginable ways. In 1266, the Assize of Bread and Ale was created. It was a law that was introduced into Britain in the 13th century to help control the sale of bread and ale and to stop the suspected corruption and greed of bakers and millers, who were thought to scheme together to rise prices. If you lived in medieval England, chances are you wouldn't have owned an oven in your home. Ovens were very large and expensive, making them out of reach for your average person. Homes were usually just equipped with a pot over a fire, which you'd have had to have made do with for most of your cooking needs. This was okay for cooking meals like soups and broths, but not so good at baking bread, an important staple in the medieval diet. The demand for easily available bread led to bakers popping up in most areas, ready to feed the hungry community whilst also making a living for themselves. But back then, bakers had a bad reputation. It was believed that they would often overcharge their customers for smaller loaves or bad quality bread. This led to the law being introduced, and it was the first food regulation law in British history. Bakers now had to ensure that the bread that they sold was of a set weight and price in accordance with the new law. Ale and other products were also treated in a similar fashion. The only problem with this was that many bakers didn't even own scales. They would often work by sight and feel instead of by weight of ingredients. And if they messed up and accidentally sold underweight bread, they could get into some serious trouble. Regulators would walk the streets, searching for lawbreakers, only adding to the bakers' stress and anxiety. To combat this, and to save them from the awful punishments that they could face, bakers began to give away an extra piece of bread with every sale. This practice is where the term a baker's dozen originated from, a baker's dozen being 13 instead of 12. Because if you ordered a dozen bread rolls in medieval England, the baker would give you 13 instead, with the extra roll being free of charge just to cover themselves and ensure that they've hit the correct weight. The bakers were in such fear of the new regulations that they happily gave away their product for free just to avoid the awful consequences. If you were caught breaking the regulations, or even accidentally baked a bad batch of bread, you'd likely face large fines and humiliating, painful punishments, like being dragged through the town with the bad bread tied around your neck, or being put in the pillory where angry crowds would shout at you whilst throwing stones and rotten vegetables. This law remained in place in Britain for a further 6 centuries before it was finally abolished, although it underwent many changes and variations over the years. 2. Removing beached whales. A strange 14th century British law states that no whale beached on British shores could be removed. Just like everything else in Great Britain, it automatically belonged to the Crown. This law was introduced by King Edward II in 1322 and is still active in Britain today. Edward II declared that the head of the whale should be given to the king or queen, and that all dolphins, porpoises, sturgeons and whales that were caught within 3 miles of British shores are classed as royal fish and are the property of the Crown. This includes any that have washed up or become stranded on British beaches. News even broke in 2004 when a man named Robert Davies offered a £9 sturgeon he had caught on the Welsh coast to the Queen, but she politely declined. The sturgeon, who was named Stanley by the press, is now on display in the Natural History Museum in London. 3. Gossiping. In medieval England, even gossiping with your friends could see you face brutal punishment. From around 1350, the act of scolding had become a common law throughout Britain. Anyone who was deemed a nuisance could be accused of being a scold and face harsh punishments that could even be deadly. It was mostly women who were targeted and accused of being scolds, and offences included gossiping, nagging, speaking badly of your husband, using bad language, arguing, upsetting your neighbours, or just genuinely being too loud and outspoken. Punishments for a common scolding could be severe. Many would undergo the dreaded ducking stool punishment, which meant being bound to a large chair and then repeatedly dunked into a deep river or pond. This punishment was designed to humiliate, but it could also be fatal. Another common punishment for women who spoke too freely was the scold's bridle, an awful, heavy head cage that had an uncomfortable mouthpiece to hold the victim's tongue and physically stop them from talking. They would then often be paraded through the streets for the entire community to see and shame. These brutal and humiliating punishments were meant to force those that underwent them to repent. It was used to control the population and to keep people in line. 4. No sex today. In medieval Britain, the church had its say on almost every aspect of daily life, and even your sex life wasn't safe. Firstly, sex was completely off the table unless you were married, and was only acceptable for the purpose of procreation. And sex was only permitted between a man and a woman, with activities between people of the same sex being viewed as deviant and sinful. The medieval church also claimed that sex in any position other than the missionary position was a mortal sin. And there was a whole list of religious laws on what sexual activities were off limits, even for married couples. This included self-pleasure of any kind, oral and other orifices, woman on top, during pregnancy or nursing, and trying to prevent a pregnancy in any way. Basically, sex was okay as long as it was not done for pleasure. These bizarre rules also dictated on what days you was allowed to have sex, with the act being banned on many days throughout the year. Sex was only allowed on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. The rest of the week you was meant to be preparing your body for Holy Communion and worshipping God on Sundays. Sex was also a no-go during any religious festivals or holidays, including for up to 62 days during Lent and for 35 days before Christmas. Luckily, the punishment for breaking these rules around sex usually only resulted in offenders paying penance by way of charity, repentance, and prayer, unlike our next crime, which would often have deadly consequences. 5. Blasphemy. In medieval England, blasphemy was common law, and the punishments were severe, extreme, and often fatal. Any words spoken against God or the church would be deemed as heresy. Things that could get you into trouble included questioning the Bible or Christianity, attempting to ridicule the religion, speaking about atheism, mocking God's name or powers, and showing any disrespect at all to God or Christianity. You didn't even have to speak these words to get into trouble. Those who wrote books or papers that included blasphemy were also found guilty. The usual awful punishment for heretics was being burnt at the stake, but other horrendous punishments were also inflicted on those guilty of blasphemy, including flogging, being burnt or branded, and even having your tongue pulled out with hot pliers to prevent you from ever speaking your evil words again. 6. Hunting the wrong deer. In medieval Britain, hunting was not only seen as a fun pastime, but it was an important way to put food on the table. But be careful where you hunt, as accidentally hunting the wrong deer could cost you greatly. After 1066, William the Conqueror became king and declared that many of the forests in Britain were now royal forests and were protected under forest law. Royal forests were reserved purely for use by the king and his entourage. You need to be granted permission by the king to hunt in one of his royal forests. You'd have had to have been of high status and would usually have had to have paid for the privilege in the rare occasion that your request was granted. This was extremely unpopular with the people, as these royal forests eventually consisted of up to a quarter of England, leaving little land for the rest of the population. The forest law granted red deer, hare, boar, and wolves royal protection, reserving the right to hunt them purely for the king and those who he deemed worthy of the privilege. Unfortunately, despite these rules, wild boar and wolves in England still became extinct by the end of the medieval period. The penalties for hunting a royal deer could be very steep, as the animals were considered to be the property of the king. The illegal hunting of them was viewed as treason, which was punishable by death. Forest law was so hated that it was even mentioned in the Magna Carta in 1215, aiming to reduce the restrictions being enforced by the king, and by 1217 forest law had undergone a reform. 7. Playing football. In medieval England, even enjoying a much-loved game of football could get you into trouble. Although football back then wasn't quite like the football that we know and love today, it was a brutal and dangerous sport, so much so that it also became known as mob football. Medieval football was still played with 2 teams, but unlike today, there was no limit on how many players could join the game. Towns and villages would play against each other, often forming extremely large teams of over-competitive and out-of-control townsfolk. The football itself was usually an inflated pig's bladder, and the goalposts weren't at either end of a field, but would be markers at opposite ends of the town. It's even reported that sometimes teams would try to land the ball in the other team's church balconies. Getting caught up in a medieval football match was a very dangerous situation to be in. Huge crowds would pile into each other, pushing, shoving, and snatching at the ball without a care for anything or anyone else around them. The only rules were that your actions could not amount to murder or manslaughter, but you could do anything else that you wanted to get the ball to the other team's marker. Many suffered awful injuries at a time when there was very little medical care. Broken bones, concussions, and even deaths weren't uncommon. Towns would be reduced to rubble and wreckage after the damage and destruction caused during the games. Football resembled more of a riot sweeping through a town, rather than a friendly game of football, and the clean-up must have been long and costly for the local community. This led to football being made illegal in England in 1314 by orders of King Edward II in an attempt to save the population from the chaos and destruction that wreaked havoc during these dangerous games. Although football has changed dramatically over the centuries, with rules and regulations in place to make football a fun, fair and safe game, football hooliganism remains a problem in Britain still to this day, with violence and chaos spilling into the streets as angry supporters vent their rage, in scenes that may even have resembled the chaotic and brutal early football matches of medieval Britain, giving us a small glimpse into the past violence and over-competitiveness that might have broke out centuries ago. These are just some of the strange laws that ruled Britain during the medieval period. If you know of any more, then please add them down in the comments. Thank you for watching Tales from Our Dark Past. Don't forget to like and subscribe.